It's time now for the news review program. Stay tuned to Press TV. In the Belgian capital, Brussels, NATO defense ministers have gathered for a meeting over Ukraine. NATO chief has promised more support for Kiev after accusing Russia of preparing for new offensives.
We see no signs that President Putin is preparing for peace. What we see is the opposite. He is preparing for more war, for new offensives and new attacks. So it makes it just even more important that NATO allies and partners provide more support to Ukraine.
We understand that sending fighter jets to Ukraine is a long-term investment.
Stoltenberg also says that the alliance should provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to win the war. He says the allies are discussing delivery of aircraft to the country, but he's saying that the top priority is to send more heavy weapons and other military hardware. That after Ukrainian president pleaded for combat planes during his recent European tour. Stoltenberg also accused Russia of planning a new major operation in Ukraine. Moscow has hit back, describing NATO as a hostile organization. The Kremlin says that the alliance is making its involvement in the Ukraine conflict even clearer by the comments. Now, time now to get some insight into this and more information, so let me invite a couple of guests. Our correspondent in Brussels, Jerome Hughes, is joining me. Also with me is George Samueli. He's a senior research fellow with Global Policy Institute in Budapest. Good to see you both. Now, Jerome, despite all the rallies that we have seen happening, every now and then, just last week we had a big one in London, then the other day we had in Paris, France, elsewhere in Brussels also you had some people are complaining about cost of living, they're complaining about economic issues. Still, NATO is insisting, and also European allies in the US, to send more and more weaponry, and this time even longer range missile and more advanced weaponry to Ukraine. So what's the plan? What's the EU going to do?
Well, Bahruz, there's 347 million people living in the Eurozone. There's 20 countries in the Eurozone, and we have seen protests in relation to the cost of living, which, is a direct link to the war in Ukraine and all of the money that's being sent to Ukraine while people are struggling back home. And there's growing opposition, of course, in terms of the policies that are making the cost of living worse, in terms of the European Central Bank raising interest rates, but also there's growing opposition to the war itself. More and more people now are calling for peace. And actually, you talk about NATO, but there is an outlier there in terms of Hungary. We know that it's been widely reported in Hungarian media that on the sidelines of meetings last Thursday here in Brussels, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, was talking to Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, and talking about the need for peace negotiations and to de-escalate. Now, we didn't hear much about that broadly in the international media, but certainly that's what happened. So, there isn't total unity within NATO in terms of keeping this going. But just another figure for you. Most of the EU members, or most of the NATO members, are also in the EU. They're EU members. And the EU as a whole, this is another figure we heard last Thursday, a new figure from the European Commission, von der Leyen released it. 67 billion euro has been sent from the EU to Ukraine in the past 11 months. And one more figure for you, which we heard today in the European Parliament. The European Commission confirmed this figure. Only 9 countries have been involved in the helping Syrians following the earthquake a week ago. And the total amount of money that's been sent by the European Commission to Syria since that disaster affecting millions of people in Syria has been 3.5 million. So compare 67 billion to Ukraine to 3.5 million to the people of Syria. And it gives you an idea of where the EU has its priorities, and also NATO.
It also gives you an idea how duplicitous they are when it comes to human rights and equality. Okay, George, more weaponry, longer range weapons, fighter jets, all of them for Ukraine. And this is what Stoltenberg is saying. This is all needed because Ukraine must win the war. So where is this war going to?
Well, it's going to continued escalation. And NATO is a one-trick pony. I mean, it constantly harping on about bombs for peace. If you send us more bombs, send more weapons, and that's the way to achieve peace. Bombs save lives. And they've done this in every conflict. They did it in Yugoslavia, they did it in Libya, they did it in Syria, and now they're doing this in Ukraine. But of course, it doesn't achieve anything. I mean, we heard, about the javelins, the anti-tank javelins. That's going to make the difference. That's going to be the game changer. Then it was, the HIMARS. Oh, the HIMARS are going to be the game changer. Then it was the tanks that are going to be the game changer. Now it's the fighter jets that are going to be the game changer. Well, of course, they're not going to be the game changer. Well, how many tanks will Ukraine get? Let's say 200 tanks. Well, what's 200 tanks against the 3,000 that the Russians are going to deploy? It's nothing. And they know it's nothing. This is all about continuing the escalation until finally there will be an inevitable direct shootout between NATO and Russia, because Ukraine cannot win this war. And NATO knows Ukraine cannot win this war, and therefore the more NATO get itself entangled with the fate of Ukraine, the more difficult it will be for NATO to step off. And I don't think NATO is going to step up. And I think that we are heading towards an almighty cataclysmic shooting war between NATO and Russia.
Okay, and George, let's also talk a little about this and elaborate on this. The reason, what is it that pushes EU and the US, the West on one side, and they are doing this to launch this proxy war, and Mr. Zelensky is just getting himself and his people, killed in the middle of all this. But the West is saying that we must win the war. Let our viewers know what it is that's pushing, especially the Europeans that are, what they are going through, the energy costs and all those issues, but they are still adamant that Ukraine must win the war, and they're ready to do whatever it takes.
Well, the EU policy has been dictated by NATO, and NATO policy in turn has been dictated by the United States. So the United States has been the driving force of all of this from the beginning, going all the way back to 2014. Well, the US policy is quite obvious. They don't want a Russia-China alliance. They had to decide who were they going to take on first, Russia or China. Trump, I think, wanted to take on China. The Biden, and before that the Obama people, the Democrats, they want to take on Russia. They decided that they're going to knock out Russia, and that once they've knocked out Russia, it'll be much easier to deal with China. So that's one goal. Another goal is, of course, to eliminate Europe as any kind of an economic rival to the United States, and that goal is largely being achieved. I mean, that's clearly what was behind the destruction of the Nord Stream gas pipelines. That eliminated German ability to get cheap energy from Russia, which powered the big German economic powerhouse. So the United States have eliminated that. So it's a twofold goal, which is destroy Europe economically and destroy Russia politically and militarily, and then it'll be the turn of China to be dealt with.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Jerome Hughes in Brussels, George Samueli in Budapest with their contribution. Thank you for watching this edition of the News Review on Press TV.